I thought it would. Oh, sorry, I did forget to say that we are going to be recording this, but we do have a series of courses, and what we wanted to do in honor of National Indigenous Peoples Day was to provide this free forum presentation to those of you who would be interested in following. So thank you all for joining me, and the session will be recorded, and so if you do not want to be seen, I would encourage everyone, they could turn off their cameras, and we will make this available as a link to Zoom, as well as if we can figure out how to do it as well on our PATH Facebook page. So I believe everybody can see this presentation that I have here. So I would just, I'm going to use this as I move along in our discussions. This image is quite, how do we say, painful to look at, because it very much encapsulates what the residential school story was all about. Because what it does is it shows that the schools themselves had a purpose, and that purpose was to take children and to strip them away from their families, take everything from them of what they knew, and turn them into what you see, that image on the right hand side. So not only did they take their clothing, they cut their hair, they gave them other clothing to wear. And that is why, if some of you are familiar with Orange Shirt Day at the end of September, that's why we honor Orange Shirt Day, and people wear orange shirts, because it's a story. Phyllis Webstad, who was a young girl who had her special shiny orange shirt taken away from her when she went to residential schools, and that's where that came from. So sadly, if you look at this image, this encapsulates the story of residential schools. And unfortunately, it is a very dark chapter in Canada's history, and a chapter that many of us don't really know anything about. And I can personally say that I did not know much about residential schools myself, even though I know that I have relatives who have attended a residential school. So I mentioned that I belong to the Chapleau Cree First Nation in northeastern Ontario, and there was a residential school there that closed down in the 1940s. And yet many people didn't even know it. Or if they knew, they said it was the Indian school, but they didn't know what that meant, and they didn't know what went on there. And so especially since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have heard stories from survivors. And you'll notice we use the word survivors. We don't use graduates, we don't use students, we use survivors, because they survived these schools. And really, they were not schools. Survivors have called them prisons or labor camps. They really were not schools in the sense of schools that we understand today. And so these children went to these schools, and this was a policy of the federal government. And so I'm going to read you a quote, and this is from Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. And sadly, this is what he had to say about residential schools in 1879. And this is why you see people toppling his statues just happening now in the news, if you've read it. This is one reason why. He said, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools, where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men." So if this is how our first Prime Minister thought about Indigenous children, you can imagine how Indigenous children were treated when they went to these schools. I just want to let you know that there's some disturbing content that I'll be talking about over the next 40 minutes or so. We will open it up for questions at the end. If you would like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat. And those of you on Facebook can also comment. What my colleague David is monitoring them there, and we can perhaps answer some of your questions by the end of this session. And as mentioned, we will be recording this. So if you want to share it or rewatch it at a later time, you can do that. And this is just a portion from one of our cultural awareness courses. And so I've just pulled out the piece about residential schools because, of course, we've all heard the devastating news that's come out of these schools across Canada. So did these residential schools help children, quote, acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men? Well, in some ways, yes, but at a terrible cost with devastating consequences. The earliest residential schools were built or repurposed in the mid-1800s, but many of them starting in after Confederation were built or repurposed in Canada. The very last residential school did not close down until 1996. And yes, I did say that correctly, 1996. That was in Saskatchewan. All of these churches were administered and paid for by the federal government, mandated through the federal legislation Indian Act, but they were run by various churches or church organizations. I think about 60% of them were run by the Catholic Church or various organizations within the Catholic Church, and the rest were Anglican, United Churches, and a few others, but the majority was the Catholic Church. By 1885, and as different amendments were made to the Indian Act, it became mandatory for children to attend residential schools. If they did not, their parents faced imprisonment or they were fined. And there are many stories of families who tried to hide their children in the bush when they saw the Indian agent or the RCMP or someone from the church come to their homes to take their children from them. And yet most of those children did end up at these schools. And often the schools were far away. If the intention was to get them away from their families, then those schools were often far away from their homes. I mentioned that I had to learn about the shocking truth of a residential school where I grew up. Well, I heard from the work that I do in NVision. I work with many different Indigenous communities, and one of my clients was from Waswanipi in the Iuiski, so in northern Quebec, in the Cree territory of northern Quebec. And she said that her family went to the school in Chapleau. I was talking with a well-known Indigenous filmmaker, and she's from like Odanak, and that area is outside of Montreal, and her family went to the residential school in Chapleau. So it isn't like you just send your kids down the street to go to a school. These were often purposefully put far away. And so the children had to attend these schools. Imagine what it would have been like, first of all, from the perspective of the families when children were sent to residential schools. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to a First Nation reserve, but many of them are quite small. In fact, I think the majority of them are less than 1,000 people. So imagine in a community of less than 1,000 people, if suddenly there were no children in the entire community, and everyone is distraught because their children have been taken from them. Imagine what that does to the psyche of the community and the families. And then, of course, imagine what it would be like to be a child attending these schools. It's bad enough if you're a parent and you have to send your children to these schools. And I mean, remember that at the time, this was a treaty right. This came out of Treaty Number 1, which was that the First Nations wanted to have schools built on their reserve because they wanted to keep their own cultures, yes, but they also wanted to learn, quote, the white man's ways, but they wanted to do it in their own communities. But for economic reasons and the ability to help people assimilate, quote unquote, the idea of these residential schools, these regional schools, was the effort that happened instead of having them locally. And one of the architects of that idea was I can't remember his first name, Egbert, maybe something Ryerson. So the university that's named after him, he was one of the architects of the residential school system. So again, this is why people can be seen spray painting or trying to topple statues, because these are people that were the architects of this horrible school system. That, quote unquote, I use this word school loosely. And so that's why you'll see that happening. But what happened again, by the turn of the century, Indigenous children living on reserve. Now there were also Inuit and Métis that attended residential schools, and Métis also attended what were called day schools, and some First Nations also attended day schools. So they didn't live in, but the horror stories are just the same. And Inuit, again, were also forced to attend residential schools. So these schools were scattered all across the country, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if you go to their website, has a map of all the residential schools in Canada. So this is quite a lot. And we're talking more than 150,000 children that attended these residential schools. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when they came out with their report, they have evidence, and they can see that there were, at least 6,000 children who died. 6,000 children who died. And again, this is all in the TRC report, but they say that that number is much higher. They just don't have any records for it. And as you all watched and heard in the news, we know there are unmarked graves in every residential school site. I guarantee you they would find them everywhere. There certainly were some in the St. John's residential school in Chapleau, and that was a small residential school. And so these are horrendous stories when we think that these schools had all of these graveyards. And in fact, one of the TRC commissioners, her name is Marie Wilson. Marie Wilson said something, and I heard this several years ago after they came out with their report, and it was quite chilling. And what she said was, she said that the TRC and the commissioners looked at photographs of all of the residential school sites. They visited the former sites of some residential schools. And she said, and I'm paraphrasing, not every school had a playground, but every school had a graveyard. Not every school had a playground, but every school had a graveyard. And I was speaking with a survivor from St. John's Residential School in Chapleau, and he said that at that school, they actually built the playground on the unmarked graves. And they made some of the older children dig the graves for these children. We cannot imagine how traumatic that would be. And that was the reality, I would say, at every residential school. And Canadians are not yet even willing to admit in some cases that this happened. I heard from a colleague who said that people were complaining that that the media was using the word mass grave, that they weren't mass graves. Well, just because 215 bodies were not found in a pit altogether, does that mean it's okay that they're unmarked graves scattered around a school? It's ridiculous, but that's the attitude that we sometimes see. So another reason why it's important for us to be educated about our own history, and this is our own history. Retired Senator Murray Sinclair was the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he was quoted as saying, "Truth is hard, and this is hard to hear. Imagine how hard it was for people to live through." But he said reconciliation is harder. And we don't know what that looks like. Everybody's doing different things in a different part of the country, in different spheres of influence. But we have to make sure that we do not repeat what's happened in residential schools. And imagine these children that, again, would go to these schools, some as young as 3. If you read what happened, they could see that there were children as young as 3 going to these residential schools. And when they left, some of them were there until they were 15 or 16 years old. And when they left these schools, they were not prepared to enter the workforce, the quote, white man's world, as John A. Macdonald said, because their education was substandard, because that wasn't the purpose of the schools. It was, the purpose was to, as was said, or has, you know, the idea, right? Kill the Indian to save the child, or kill the Indian in the child. And that was the purpose. Education was certainly not top of mind. Now, certainly you will talk to survivors who say they may have learned to read and write. They may have been, you know, have received some education, but we're not here to look for positive stories. Senator Lynn Bayak from Northwestern Ontario was chastised, and she had to leave the Senate, I believe, because she wanted to say, well, it wasn't that bad, or I've heard people tell positive stories. That's not really the point. The point is that this policy has had a devastating intergenerational impact on First Nations and Inuit and Métis, and it was wrong to start with. It's not helpful to just say, well, maybe some people got an education out of it, or, you know, had made friends. It's not about that. It's about the system. And this is why we talk about systemic racism. This was a system in Canada that contributed to discrimination against Indigenous people, and really contributed to the loss of language and cultures and way of life that today many Indigenous people have to really struggle and work hard to try to revitalize all those things that were lost through residential school and other colonial policies. This talk is just about residential schools, but we could talk about the Indian Act, we could talk about the 60s scoop, we could talk about our justice system. But even in terms of residential schools, this is why we talk about intergenerational trauma. Imagine if a child, they're now 16 years old and they leave these schools. Again, they don't fit into mainstream society, and they were made to feel ashamed of who they were, and everything was taken from them, their culture, their language. And so they don't feel like they would belong back in their communities. They were made to feel ashamed of who they were. So they don't fit into mainstream society. They don't fit back into their communities. And they've come out because there's documented evidence from the TRC and survivors talking about every possible kind of neglect, every possible kind of abuse, every possible kind of malnutrition. There were medical experiments that were done on these children. And there was even an electric chair at the residential school in Fort Albany in Northern Ontario that they used on these children. So imagine how broken these children are as they become adults. And as they become adults and they begin to have children, what kind of parents do you think they could be? They have no experience of what it was like to have a loving family and home. And so they carry on and pass on that trauma that they experienced to the next generation and the next generation. And this is why we say it's intergenerational trauma. The other thing, unfortunately, that we've all heard is, you know, just get over it. How do you get over that? You have to work through those cycles and break those cycles of intergenerational trauma. And I have the utmost respect for all the people that have done that in their generation and those who are doing it in this current generation, because it is not easy. And so we can't just say, just get over it. It doesn't happen like that. And that needs to be attitudes that we all need to change, those of us here in Canada. I would like to play a very short video for you now. It's 1 minute long. Please note that it is disturbing. And if you are a survivor of residential school, please contact the crisis line, and the phone number is there on your screen. If you are not a survivor, but you are triggered by this, then please contact wherever you work if you have access to mental health supports. So again, this is just a 1-minute video, and you can find this video on, you can just Google it you can Google it and find it on the Heritage Minutes. It's a Heritage Minute, and it's a particular story of a particular boy who attended a residential school, and this is from the 1960s. So I'm just going to play this 1-minute video right now.
Johnny wanted to go back home. It was 1,000 kilometers away. They forced him to go to the Indian residential school. More than 150,000 of us children had to go. They wanted to change us.
Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name.
Hallowed be your name.
Thy kingdom come,
Thy kingdom come,
thy will be done.
thy will be done.
Kill the Indian and the child. It's been called cultural genocide.
Sorry. Just having trouble here. Oh, sorry about that, everybody. I was having trouble with.
Survived residential. I survived residential school. My brother Johnny did not.
Johnny Wenjack was one of thousands of children who died due to Canada's residential school system. More than 80,000 survivors and their families still live with its legacy today.
So that was a tragic story, and that's only one story. So Chani Wenjack was, I think, 12 years old, and things were so bad at the residential school that he wanted to escape. And so he ran away, and he went to the railroad tracks because he knew that if he followed the railroad tracks, he would eventually get home, except that his home was 1,000 kilometers away. And so he died by the side of the railroad tracks. And the reason why people know this story about Chani Wenjack is because a journalist with Maclean's magazine in 1967 wrote about this story. And I read an article that talked about how that journalist was barely even able to get this story into Maclean's because the editor said, who cares about that story? But he was able to get that story in 1967. And so again, not everybody read, Maclean's magazine in that issue in 1967, but we can't say that Canadians had no idea what was going on. And so he shared that story in Maclean's magazine. And then many years later, now a few years ago, Gord Downey of the Tragically Hip, who's now passed away, he heard that story about Chani Wenjack, and as his last project, he created a music album and a graphic novel and an animated film called The Secret Path. And after he passed away, there was a fund that was created called the Gord Downey and Chani Wenjack Fund, which does work in reconciliation. And certainly, if any of you are looking for ways to support, I'll have a list of some organizations at the end. This is one of them, but it is not run by Indigenous peoples. And we always say to support Indigenous organizations when you can, and there are many out there that you can do. And again, I'll give a little bit of a list at the end. So you might ask, how did this happen? How did we let this happen? How did we not know about this? Well, of course, I can tell you the government of Canada certainly knew about it. And for some brief moments, the Canadian public were aware as well. And I just want to tell you a brief story about someone. And his name was Dr. Peter Bryce. So Dr. Peter Bryce, he is considered a residential school, what we would call today a whistleblower. So there's a very good film, and it's called Finding Peter Bryce. I think it's on YouTube. I would definitely check it out if you're interested. So Dr. Peter Bryce was Canada's first chief medical officer of health, originally for the Ontario government and then for the federal government at the turn of the 20th century. He was seconded to the Department of Indian Affairs and asked to travel to select residential schools to document the health of the children. Well, when he returned in 1906, he wrote a scathing report that showed high mortality rates, a tuberculosis epidemic, poor sanitation, poor ventilation, not enough food, and other horrors. He was so distraught that he made sure that the media knew about what was going on at the time, and it made news across the country. And it was horrible. And he was so upset by it. And he went to his superiors at the Department of Indian Affairs and he said, "This is not acceptable. How are we allowing this to happen?" And he said, you need to invest more money. Now, of course, he didn't say we need to shut down the schools altogether. Again, part of the racist structures we were in. But he did say, we can't treat children like this. We need to put more money into it. But the bureaucrats at the time disagreed and they did not put more money into it. And so there's a very interesting comparison between someone like Dr. Peter Bryce and the bureaucrats at the time. And the Minister of Indian Affairs at that time was someone named Duncan Campbell Scott. And up until not that long ago, he was a celebrated Canadian poet, but he was also the Minister of Indian Affairs. And his racist attitudes is what contributed to the way that the children were treated at these schools. And just a couple of days ago, I saw an article about these two men in the Ottawa Citizen, and you can Google them and find out more about them. But ironically, both of them are buried at Beechwood Cemetery, which is kind of the main sort of national cemetery here in Ottawa. And they're both buried there. And there was some really important work done by an organization called the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. And what the woman who runs that organization, Cindy Blackstock, she's amazing and has done incredible work for First Nations children. She heard about this story about Peter Bryce, and she knew about the story and knew about Duncan Campbell Scott. And when she found out they were both buried in the same cemetery, she had a fundraising campaign. And now if you go there, and it's public, you can now see a plaque that's there in front of Dr. Peter Bryce's gravestone, and you can see a plaque in front of Duncan Campbell Scott. So people sometimes say, well, why don't we just tear down all of these monuments? But we won't understand the context or the history if we do that. So I think this idea of acknowledging, right? Acknowledging what their accomplishments are, okay, but acknowledging what their role was in this place. And so Peter Bryce, Dr. Peter Bryce is what, today we use this word ally. He was an ally, but it came as a cost for him because after he submitted his report and it went public, there was no public outcry. There were no demands for the government to do something. So, Dr. Peter Bryce was punished for being the whistleblower and for speaking up. He ended up losing his job and the residential schools continued on. And Duncan Campbell Scott continued on as well in his role. And he was not reprimanded in any way because this was the policy of the government. And this is why we need to address policies wherever we work or wherever we live. What are the structures and policies that enabled something like residential schools to happen? And we have to make sure that it never happens again, even though it does still happen. The horrible stories about the unfair treatment of First Nations children and the lack of funding and lack of running water and everything happening on reserves. There's all kinds of other things that do continue to happen. But this residential school story, the chapter's not closed just because the last school is closed. And so we have to acknowledge not just the allies, but the important work that Indigenous people are doing. And as an ally, the main thing we can do is amplify Indigenous voices. So let Indigenous people decide, let Indigenous people speak. Now, talking about residential school, it's difficult for the survivors to speak. And so they're not here doing this presentation to you because many people even had difficulty talking to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and they did not tell their story. And there are still many, many stories that have not yet been told. But those who do share their story, it's important to listen to their voices. So there are a number of things that you can do. And this is, I'll just finish this story about Dr. Peter Bryce, because the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, once they learned about the story of Dr. Peter Bryce, is they actually created an annual award in his name. So the Peter Henderson Bryce Award is for a young person or a group of young people who stand up for the safety, health, or well-being of Métis, Inuit, or First Nations children. This award honors the work of children and youth who demonstrate commitment to Indigenous children's health, safety, and well-being. And so there's just one example of how people are trying to make a difference. And we want to acknowledge people trying to make a difference, even if it is difficult. And it was difficult. And Dr. Peter Bryce was courageous to stand up, because he was definitely in the minority. And I hope now in 2021 that we can say that the majority of people want to make a difference and want to stand up and speak out. And that's our role. As Maya Angelou said, if we don't know how to do better, how can we be better? But once we know better, then we can be better and do better. And we do need to do that. And so education is often the first step. And there are many ways that you can support Indigenous organizations and those working in this area of reconciliation. Of course, the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, which is now the repository of all of the testimonies, the reports, and everything that came out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's a physical location in Winnipeg, but you can go to their website and hear others' stories and testimonies, so that we have this and we can never forget. The Indian Residential School Survivors Society, this is based in British Columbia, but any support that you provide goes directly to Indian residential school survivors. The Legacy of Hope Foundation, this also supports projects to support residential school survivors, and they have a number of different projects that have helped communities and families. The Orange Shirt Society, I mentioned a little bit earlier about Orange Shirt Day at the end of September every year. People wear orange shirts in honor of the story of Phyllis Webstad. And she actually wrote a children's book about how she went to residential school, and she was so excited to go to school, and her mother got her this beautiful shiny orange shirt to wear for her first day of school. She wore it for her first day of school, and it was taken from her on that first day of school. And that is a symbol of what the residential schools have done. And that's why you'll see people wearing orange shirts on September the 29th or September the 30th every year. That's Orange Shirt Day. Reconciliation Canada is another organization that is working Indigenous and non-Indigenous, bringing people together for education and work. I've already mentioned the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society that's doing some excellent work. And then I had mentioned the Gord Downey and Chani Wenjack Foundation or Fund. Again, there are others. This is just a sort of sample of them, but I would encourage you to make sure that you're supporting Indigenous-led, Indigenous-run organizations and charities, because now is the time to, as I said earlier, amplify those Indigenous voices and make space for Indigenous people. This is what self-determination is about. This is what sovereignty is about. And one of the first steps, because people say, well, what can we do? Well, obviously, we don't want to repeat that residential school era, but education is often the very first step. And just the fact that you've decided to tune in to this presentation today says that you want to be educated, you want to learn. And that's a hard task too. And you can't rely on Indigenous people to do that education for you, but there are various places where you can get educated and learn more and do cultural awareness. And of course, I work for NVision, so I will promote our own Indigenous cultural awareness courses. under our suite of courses called The Path. And what I've spoken to you about today is from our first foundational course called The Path, Your Journey Through Indigenous Canada. We also have a course on anti-Indigenous racism, cultural bias, and stereotypes called The Path, Building Indigenous Intercultural Capacity. And so the reason why we call our courses The Path, and this is the last thought that I want to leave you with before we open it up for some questions, is we call it The Path because of something that Murray Sinclair, when he was chair of the TRC, said when they issued their reports in 2015. He said, "We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the path to the top. We call on you to do the climbing." So I would like to say miigwech and thank you for being on this, this presentation today and doing some of that climbing with me here today. So thank you all very much. We now have a few minutes and I'd be happy to answer questions, or if you would like me to elaborate on anything else. Again, I'm not speaking as a residential school survivor, and I don't speak on behalf of any nation or organization, but I would, I like to, and my colleagues said, I'm more of a guide. So if this is the path, then I'm your guide on the path as you move forward towards reconciliation. So I will ask my two colleagues, David and Angela, if there are any comments or questions that people have asked. And I can stop sharing my screen now and then see everybody. Okay, so I'll see if I've got chats, any questions. Okay, so I've got Egerton, thank you, Don Young. It was Egerton Ryerson who was one of the architects of residential school. Steve Weeb says, many Indigenous people now identify as Catholic and have a heritage of Catholicism or Anglicanism that is several generations deep. Are there supports in existence that help Indigenous people through the conundrum of having a deep Christian faith that's also associated or interconnected with such a horribly abusive past? I think most denominations have sort of a reconciliation, I don't know, groups or programs or ministries. I'm not really sure, but each denomination should have, if they don't, certainly if they ran residential schools, they do. And then people might have access to supports there. But I think the Catholic Church is the most disappointing of all. And I've seen several letters to the editor and articles where, you know, Catholics and groups, and one was like a group of nuns, and they were writing to, you know, to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops saying, you know what, you need to apologize, and the Pope needs to apologize. Of all of the denominations that ran residential schools, the Catholic Church still remains the only one that has not apologized. And again, I can't speak for those people who are Indigenous and are Catholic, because they have their own journey and their own reasons for why they may still want to be part of that church. But none of them would deny what the church sort of writ large on behalf of the federal government has done to Indigenous people through residential schools. Yes. Terry Rudden says, best single resource you would recommend to follow up. Well, of course, I have to speak about our own courses in cultural awareness, but other than that, I don't know if anyone else from my team at NVision might suggest another good resource. I think it will take some sort of digging on your part. There is another university cultural awareness course available for free from the University of Alberta. And that one is called Indigenous Canada. It's quite a bit longer than the one we offer at NVision, and it doesn't speak as much about the Inuit experience, but that's another place you could get some education. And I've been seeing more and more companies, corporations, businesses, government departments at all levels really wanting to do this kind of reconciliation work, and this idea of diversity and inclusion is really shining a spotlight, especially on how the Indigenous piece has been in some cases missing from that. And I would say be very careful in lumping together Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I guess the acronym is BIPOC is the word I've heard. Be careful of lumping them all together because under sort of diversity and inclusion, because we need to understand our own history here in Canada, because Canada has a very distinct and special relationship with Indigenous people. Black and people of color are not listed in Canada's constitution, but Canada's constitution says the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are Indians. Well, that's another story. That's part I do in the past. We're going to get rid of that word, but Indians, Inuit, and Métis. And so there's a special constitutional relationship. And of course, this is the territory of Indigenous peoples. And Angela will put up a link to a website where you can see whose territory you're on. This is another piece and another thing that you might want to consider doing. Understanding why we do land acknowledgements. That's really become more and more important as time goes on. And it's not just to acknowledge the land, but what does it mean when we understand whose land we're coming from? How does that change how you see your own place in wherever you live? It's really incumbent on us to understand our own history and where we come from. And that land acknowledgement really is the first step in that. And that's why it's important not to lump Black, Indigenous, and people of color together necessarily. Of course, it's important to understand anti-racism in general, but anti-Indigenous racism has very specific roots in our history in this land that we now call Canada. Okay, best advice for allies and supporters. So I would just, if you Google, what is an ally or how to be an ally, you'll get some ideas of what you can do, because there really isn't best advice. I don't know each of your circumstances. I don't know where you live. I don't know what maybe industry you work in. So you need to do that hard work to look within your own industry and what we call spheres of influence. Who are the people that you can influence? What policies or systems that you're familiar with can you have an influence over things that change? And maybe it's changing policies and procedures. Maybe it's doing more cultural awareness. Maybe it's doing that kind of anti-racism, cultural bias work that really opens our own eyes to the biases that we hold and we may not even realize. How that looks for each of you is going to be different, because the reconciliation journey looks different for everyone. But we all certainly have a role to play. And now that, and you can no longer unknow what you now know. And we cannot use ignorance as an excuse, especially in this age of, the internet. We can find out anything we want. I would encourage you to look for maybe podcasts, blogs, watch Aboriginal People's Television Network. I used to work there, so I have a shout out for APTN. Here in Ottawa, there's a local Indigenous radio station. Again, amplify, listen to Indigenous voices, find out what Indigenous people are saying and get their perspective, because for far too long, our voices have been silenced, or other people have told our stories. Those of you who, went to school in Canada, none of this stuff was in our textbooks. But of course, who wrote the textbooks? So now Indigenous people are getting more integrated and being asked to provide accurate information going into textbooks. And I have 2 teenagers, and I can tell you that my kids know way more than I ever knew. And they're living, again, we live here in Ottawa, so they live in the reality of diversity, right? My daughter was saying that more than half of her class is not quote unquote white. So we are seeing that dynamic changing in Canada. And I think there is a genuine desire to understand that Indigenous part of our history, right? It's not just Indigenous history. And we talk about things like treaties. or we talk about things like legislation. Well, we all have a role to play in that. We are all part of that, and we all need to play our own role to see what kind of difference we can make. Liz Edwards says, the summary of the TRC is also available to read. It's a great resource for direct information about residential schools. Absolutely. And Angela, if you could put up a link to the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action, I absolutely would recommend that you read that. And in fact, that might be the best resource or the first resource for you. There are 94 calls to action, and they cover areas of child welfare, education, the justice system. And so that you might find yourself in there and might give you some more ideas of ways that you can advance reconciliation. And of course, the reason why we're doing this today and making this available free of charge for anyone that wants to listen is in honor of the summer solstice, which is June 21st, which the federal government designated National Indigenous Peoples Day, but had always been of significance to Indigenous people because it is the longest day of the year, and the summer solstice was always seasonally an important part of every culture and tradition that you'll see. And so that's how and why it was chosen for National Indigenous Peoples Day. But not only is it a time for people to celebrate being Indigenous, it is an opportunity to reflect and to mourn and to really sort of look around us. And we've really kind of shattered that idea that Canada is a sort of such a nice country, and that, you know, we don't have this horrible history like the United States. Well, sadly, we do. It's just not, it's just a little different, but there's no such thing as a kinder and gentler genocide, because genocide is genocide. And that is the word that the report from the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report said. They called it genocide. The TRC called it cultural genocide, but the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women dropped that word cultural and said, by the definition of what genocide is, that is and was the policy of the federal government in this country. So Angela is my my technician on Zoom, and you'll see that she put in a website, and it's native-land.ca, and that's where you can find, it's an interactive map that they continually update with Indigenous peoples. And so if you want to know wherever you live, whose territory you're on, that's a good resource. And other people have asked me where else I could, how do I know what the land acknowledgement is where I live? And so my recommendation for that is to look at the website of a university or a college. So if you live in or around a major city where there's a university or college, go to their website. I've seen many of them. They've done the good hard work of engaging with and listening to the local Indigenous communities, and then they've crafted their land acknowledgement from there. So that's another good resource for anything on land acknowledgements. Okay, Devin says, I see a lot of awareness raising taking place on social media. However, I think social media is designed to commodify social interactions. I worry that social media encourages people from settler backgrounds to reframe the conversation around a settler perspective, while inadvertently diverting attention away from Indigenous voices. Are there ways to spread awareness online that don't force the issue into pre-existing settler frameworks? I think I'll just repeat what I said earlier. Amplify Indigenous voices, find Indigenous bloggers, listen to Indigenous podcasts. And they're not hard to find anymore. You know, 10, 20 years ago, you would have been hard pressed to find something. There are books by Indigenous people about residential school. Again, I just finished listening to some fabulous podcasts. You can find them out there. So again, we can't use ignorance as an excuse, and we can't continue to let non-Indigenous people speak for Indigenous people on these issues. And that's probably one of the best things that you can do on social media, is follow Indigenous people and share and tweet what Indigenous people are saying about this. Because unfortunately, racism continues to exist. And I don't know if any of you followed, but the MP from Nunavut, Mumalak Kakak, she is leaving politics, and she gave a very powerful and heartfelt goodbye speech, which isn't public, you can find it online. And she's Inuit. And she said that she's leaving politics because she felt it's so isolating. She said, I don't belong here. So this is an Indigenous person working in the House of Commons of this country saying, I don't belong here. So we are not done. We still have work to do. And she gave a very sort of passionate speech to say, we've got to sort of get beyond this. We have to get beyond platitudes. We have to get beyond thinking we're better than we really are and address those structures of racism and face the truth of our history. So I see they've also put up a few other links. So there's the link to the TRC's call to action. There's a link to our PATH courses. There's a link to the Legacy of Hope Foundation there as well. Ashley says, as you have been teaching courses like this, have you noticed a change in how these discussions are taking place over the past decades? Do you have any hopes for what the conversation will look like in 10 years? Well, I just really hope the conversation in 10 years is farther along than we are today. It is farther along than than it was 10 years ago, but the worry is that even the shock of the stories about children, bodies of children at residential schools, if that doesn't change people's trajectory, that doesn't change government policy, that doesn't change people's attitudes and behavior, then I will despair. But I'm worried that it won't, that changes won't happen, that, you know, the TRC and the calls to action will just be shelved like other reports. You know, Indigenous people will say they've been researched to death. Stop doing more research. We know what's going on. We know what's wrong. What are the solutions? Let's actually try to action some of these solutions. And I'm not saying it's easy. Things like residential schools and the legacy from that, things like the Indian Act, you know, these are deeply embedded. And I was speaking with an elder years ago and sort of lamenting that same thing. And I was talking about the Indian Act in particular, but he was talking in general. I was saying, you know, we've got to just like dismantle all these, you know, the revolution. Let's just get rid of the Indian Act. And he said something very wise. He said, you know, the problem is that these things have been around so long. He goes, they're like a gigantic tree. He said, we can chop down that tree, but those roots go deep and those roots go long. And until we figure out how to uproot that whole thing and replace it with something else, we're never going to get out of these cycles. And what that looks like is what people have been struggling with over the last few years. What does that look like? How do we make those changes? And there's no easy answers to that. And Senator Murray Sinclair said the same thing. There are no easy answers. He said it's taken many generations to get to where we are today. So he said it's going to take many more generations before we can say that we're moving forward. And even this word reconciliation, you know, I'll just throw a wrench in it. Many years ago, an Indigenous artist said, you know, why do we use this word reconciliation? There's no reconciliation going on. When we use reconciliation, we assume, and perhaps the definition of it is we want to reconcile, meaning, you know, when you talk about somebody in their marriage, they want to reconcile. That means they want to get back together. They want to get back to a place where they had a good relationship. Well, when did we ever have a good relationship between Indigenous people and the Crown, or Indigenous people and Canadian government, or Indigenous people and Canadians? When was that time? And some would argue there never was time. So we should just be calling it conciliation. Just something to think about. There's different opinions and thoughts about that. But that is something we need to grapple with. That what does reconciliation mean if we can't even sort of agree on a definition of that term? But Senator Murray Sinclair says reconciliation is about relationships. It's repairing relationships. And if there were good relationships, and if we go back, way back in our history, again, if you take the path, you'll get a schooling in this, but way back at the beginning of, you know, the Canada as we know it, it was all about economic partnerships. It was all about treaties. It was all about equal benefits. We've, unfortunately, our colonial history, we are way beyond that. It is not it is no longer fair. It is no longer mutually beneficial. So how can we get back maybe to that point when we were and we did have a relationship where there were equal benefits among them all? Okay, Sky Lee says, not to spend too much time on this, but as an Indigenous person, I wanted to emphasize sharing hotline resources and supports when sharing triggering materials on social media. While the educational intention may be for settlers, Indigenous people can see these things, and if there's a huge amount of sharing going on, it can make social media a difficult place for them to be. Also, plainly sharing without addressing hurtful or ignorant comments made by settler friends can make well-intentioned posts harmful. I completely agree with you. And that's why I wanted to say at the beginning that there's disturbing material in this. This is very difficult. And for Indigenous people, stop asking them to educate you. Stop asking them to share their pain. I heard a term just not that long ago called, I think the word was trauma porn, as if you can be a voyeur and hear about these horrible stories from people's life experiences. That is not what we want to do. But I do think it is important to acknowledge these horrors. And I agree with you, Skyly, because I had to get off of social media altogether and not listen to the news for a week or so after what happened in Kamloops, because suddenly you're mirroring the shock that all other Canadians are feeling about this, and it can be too much. It can be too much. But hopefully it's humanizing the experiences that Indigenous people have gone on. If you can relate, sympathize, try to, as people have said, walk a mile in their moccasins. Like, what would this have been like? Even if you cannot be, and you are not an Indigenous person, coming alongside, listening to Indigenous stories and people who want to share those stories. And as you say, Skyly, we have to call out anti-racist behavior. We have to be like Dr. Peter Bryce. If it's painful or difficult or awkward or embarrassing for us, it doesn't matter. We have to call it out. It's never going to change unless we all take whatever role we can to amplify those voices. So it is now 1 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody again for taking the time. Thank you for your questions and your comments. And feel free to comment on our Facebook page. And again, I wish you all the best on this journey that we're all on together of conciliation or reconciliation. So miigwech, and thank you all.
Thank you.